Turns it off. One, two. Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 1, 1. Yeah. Okay. One, two, three, four. So,
1, 2, 3, 4.
she didn't know that, did
Well, good evening. Another sold out crowd. Welcome to Keese School. I'm just going to introduce the introducer of the speaker. So I'm Frank Snyder introducing Spence Limbacher.
Is that it?
That's
all.
it.
That's it. Okay. That's fine with me. We don't need anything else. I want to thank you all for coming tonight. I think that you're probably going to learn a lot from this discussion. At least I hope you are. I know there are lots of questions out there coming off the last election and everything you see on the news, on the Senate. Ira will answer all of our questions for us, and so we also about a week ago. Ira and I sat down and decided we needed to change this this discussion because the discussion was going to mainly be around McConnell, which is the book that one of the books that Ira wrote, and we felt because McConnell has kind of stepped down that and Trump was elected, and that the Senate there are lots of implications for the Senate in this. So we're going to focus more on present day issues than we will on just looking back over the past. I got to know Ira Shapiro when he joined my book group about a year ago. Now I can't say he comes every time, but he comes quite a bit. It's a book group that's been around for about 15 years. We meet here on campus, but almost everybody in it is people that don't live here at Asbury. Ira has a 50-year career in Washington, focusing on American politics, government, and international trade. Ira served 12 years in Senate staff positions in the Senate. He worked for Senators Gaylord Nelson, Abraham Ribicoff, Tom Ingleton, Robert Byrd, and Jay Rockefeller. So he's has been around for a number of senators. Can anybody hear me? Should we? Okay, all right. He also worked for the Office of U.S. Trade Representative, and so we may talk a little bit about trade issues because that's a big thing coming up. Ira has written 3 books on the Senate. The Last Great Senate, Courage and Statesmanship in Times of Crisis, was nominated for a Pulitzer. And his most recent book is The Betrayal: How Mitch McConnell and the Senate Republicans Abandoned America, which came out in 2022. He assures me he's not going to write a 4th book, but he might, given what's going on. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, USA Today, Washington Monthly, The New Republic, and The Hill. He has also appeared on several cable talk shows. And have you been on any recently, or not recently? Okay. So that's who's sitting next to me over here. The first question that kind of came, but why did you write 3 books on the Senate?
First, thank you, Spence, for giving me the chance to be here. And it's
Like an ice cream cone.
thank you.
Yeah, that's it.
And I think the size of this wonderful crowd is more a tribute to the Keese program and to the urgency of the times than it is to the fact that I'm here, but I'm glad to be with you. I got hooked on the Senate at a very early age. I grew up, as many of us did, came of age during the 60s, some hard years for the country. And at that time, particularly in the late 60s, the Senate was kind of a beacon for those of us who were concerned about the presidencies of Lyndon Johnson and then later Richard Nixon. I got to be a Senate intern, and frankly, I got hooked on the Senate. I changed my career plans and went to law school because the lawyers were dominant at the time. I came back and I worked 12 years in the Senate, and I really loved it. And then I went off and did other things. And 25 years later, troubled by the decline of the Senate, I wrote a book about what it was like when the Senate was great, which coincidentally was when I was there. But the truth is, there's a general consensus that the Senate did have a great period in the 60s and the 70s before going into a longer decline. I didn't expect to write a second book about the Senate, but when Donald Trump became president the first time, I was in international trade. Somebody said to me, well, you must think his trade policy is really terrible. And I said, well, I think it's actually likely to be the least terrible thing about him. Because it was recognizable sort of protectionism, but having a president on that side was different. And so I used my Senate lens for the second and third books to kind of, as just as a way of looking at what was happening to the democracy. So 3 books weren't intended, it just worked out that way.
And the third book, of course, was on McConnell.
Right. Mostly on McConnell.
Mostly on McConnell, yeah. Let's focus on the presidential election. What were you surprised with in the election? In your opinion, what are the factors that account for Trump's victory and Kamala Harris's defeat?
Well, let me put this with a certain humility, because all of us are reading about some of the same things, and I'm sure we've all given it some thought. And I like to say that my political predictions have always been brilliant in the 20th century. We're a quarter of the way through this century, and I haven't always been right at all in this century. I thought, frankly, I got caught up in the excitement when the handoff from Joe Biden to Kamala Harris went smoothly. And I thought it was very possible that the excitement the surge would continue, and that she might be able to be the new generation president that the Democrats have actually produced every 16 years with precision since 1960. Obviously, it didn't work out that way. So what happened? Well, first of all, it's a bad time to be an incumbent. We're in an angry, divided, unhappy country, and I think the challenger in that sense always has some advantage. I do think that the handoff, while it was well done, happened many months too late. I don't think President Biden, who I admire greatly, but I don't think he made the right decision to go ahead with another campaign and stayed in it as long as he did. And it became very difficult for Kamala Harris, although I think she did an admirable job in many respects. I guess the other thing, though, is it is hard for the vice president and the anointed successor to Biden to also be a change agent. I think that this country always wants change, or mostly always wants change. And I think she was dealt a very difficult hand in that regard. I don't think we've reached the point, unfortunately, of being totally fair to a woman running for president and a black woman running for president. But even then, it turned out to be quite a close election. Close election, but crushingly decisive. And I guess I have to say also, though, that as James Carville always liked to tell us, it's the economy, stupid. And the inability to articulate a message on the economy to both somehow claim credit for what the improvements have been made and yet convey a concern that it wasn't reaching enough people. I don't think she was able to do it. And so adding all those things together, and I would add one thing. I think that Donald Trump was he'd have his crazy rallies and something like that to move the MAGA followers. But I think the Trump campaign was actually pretty well focused and did a pretty good job of articulating their message, better than Democrats. I've been in a lot of political campaigns, unfortunately, by now. If you're a Democrat of a certain age, you've lost a lot of elections. Al Gore once said when he was running in 2000, too many voices in my head. And he was talking about all the consultants arguing about what should be said. And I think the Republicans have done a better job of having a focused message.
Thanks. What do you make of Trump's nominations to date? Because this is a critical challenge that he's presented to the Senate in its job at advise and consent function. What do you make of these? We read every day about the nominations.
Well, I think they sort of run the gamut from normal kind of Republican stuff like the Secretary of Treasury nominee to utterly crazy and indefensible. I mean, I don't think it's exaggerated to say that Matt Gaetz, Tulsi Gabbard, I mean, the top four, Pete Hegseth and Robert Kennedy Jr., I think these are people that should not be in public office, should not be nominated, should not have been nominated, but if they were nominated, they shouldn't be confirmed. And I think it's fitting and appropriate that the Senate has this challenge to face. The Senate got us where we are today. The Senate failed in its responsibility to stop a president who had abused his power 4 years ago. They didn't stop Trump when they had the chance to. They didn't disqualify him in the second impeachment trial. Having done that, failed to do that, now we reap the whirlwind, and here we are. So the question is, will they step up to their responsibility finally? My expectations were sufficiently low that getting Matt Gaetz out and sort of withdrawn as Attorney General was at least a promising thing. The Senate Republicans did not say, oh yeah, we'll go along with that nomination. So I'm hoping that they will develop some muscles or some muscle memory that, yeah, we're supposed to be senators. Donald Trump won the right to nominate these people, but he didn't win the right to bypass the Senate, and he shouldn't have won the right for the Senate to roll over. We don't know the answer yet on some of these, but at least the first one was, I think, a good sign.
Let's turn a little bit to Mitch McConnell, who really ran the Senate for 18 years. He's now stepped down from his leadership position and taken other positions, and whether or not he'll run again, we don't know. But talk a little bit about Mitch McConnell. How did he manage to retain power for all that time? And what were some of the highlights or the lowlights of the things that he did?
Well, first, I need to stipulate that I am obsessed with Mitch McConnell. 10 years ago, I called him the most dangerous Senate leader. 4 years after that, I called him the other threat to our democracy. And my last book was basically about how he failed the country by not stopping Trump. However, I just wrote a book review of a biography of his where I had to say he's been a brilliant tactician and strategist. No one has been better at accomplishing their objectives than McConnell. How did he do it? Well, there's a combination of things, but one is that nobody understands politics better. Nobody works harder at it. And I wrote that he had outworked, outthought, and outlasted everyone else. He also, his biographer said, one of the keys is he doesn't care what people think of him. Absolutely, he's had a terrible approval rating all over the country. He only cares about what the Senate Republicans cared about him, and as long as the people of Kentucky kept him in office. The last thing that I would say, and by the way, I'm a Senate guy, so I can filibuster. The last thing I would say about him is no one understands the role of money in politics better than McConnell. He understood the donor base of the Republican Party. He raised huge amounts of money from them. He gave them legislative and regulatory results and the Supreme Court they wanted, and then raised more money. And he's done a brilliant job of it. I regret he said recently, I thought this was interesting. He said recently, history will settle every account. I'm trying to help settle his account, but I don't know of anyone who's had more impact and more deleterious impact on the country than McConnell, with the possible exception of Donald Trump.
So talk a little bit, dig a little more deeply into what you think his legacy is going to be, what McConnell's legacy will be, and will he challenge Trump, which he really didn't do when he was leader, but now in a different position. Is he going to be able to challenge Trump, or will he?
Right now, if you had to guess at his legacy, it would be the thing that he didn't do, stop Trump, when he had every chance to do it. And the thing he did do gives us the radical Supreme Court that we have now. That's a big legacy. Whether he will try to make it somewhat better in the next 2 years, we'll have to see. He did make it clear that he wasn't going to support Matt Gaetz, and that was good. He did stand up last year for Ukraine, funding for Ukraine, despite Trump's opposition to it. I've always said I give McConnell credit for everything he does for the country. It just doesn't take very many pages.
So much for legacy. With Trump returning to the White House, along with the Republican Senate and House and Supreme Court, what keeps you up at night? I know what keeps me up at night. What keeps you up at night?
Nothing keeps me up at night. I sleep like a baby. It's the days that are bad. Look, the real question that it's on, I think, my mind, it's probably on all of our minds. Is this, it's another election. We have elections every 4 years presidential. We have elections less than 2 years from now congressional. We've had these elections. Is this something that's just a little worse than Reagan or just a little worse than Trump won? Or is it something fundamentally worse? The shorthand being Germany in the 1930s. I don't think we know yet. I think partly we don't know because there's certain parts of Trump that are very constant, which are worrisome. And then there are things that are mercurial about him. Will he decide, now that he's made his historic comeback, that all he wants out of life is a Nobel Peace Prize? We don't know. But there are some things that are very disturbing, and among them are some of the people around him, particularly Chief Strategist Steve Bannon, who's still close to Trump. Bannon is a self-proclaimed revolutionary. He doesn't want to fix the government. He wants to burn it down. And he said that. And so there are a lot of people there. Well, many of the people around Trump would feed Trump's instincts to be more of an authoritarian. I mean, Trump, has said, give him credit for transparency. I want to be dictator on day one, So there are some people around Trump that are vaguely normal, but how it will go remains to be seen. I do think if you separate it out, there's some stuff that's kind of the normal Republican stuff, right? We're going to cut taxes. We're going to cut taxes for the wealthy. We're going to deregulate. We have to pay for it somehow, so we'll have to go after your Medicare or Medicaid or Social Security. In some of those, I think Congress will actually say, no, not really. We're not going to go along with that. We're not going to destroy the Affordable Care Act, et cetera. So that's kind of in the normal range of Republican politics and government. But the other part, I do think we will see mass deportations. I don't think we'll see 12 million people deported, but we'll see a lot of people deported. And I am worried that we will see a weaponized Justice Department and investigation and prosecution of some of Trump's political enemies. His lifelong method of responding to people who wronged him, in his mind, has been to hit back and take revenge. And he does believe he's been unfairly persecuted and prosecuted for 4 years. The last thing I would say about that for the moment, the reason I wrote my book, the last book, was my belief that the Senate was the way, the constitutional way to deal with an overreaching president. I never really thought the legal process would work very well. I thought it would struggle because it wasn't suited to the job. And so the Senate failed us, and the legal process couldn't measure up to what needed to be done. Then it was left to the voters, and they didn't do too well.
One of the things you didn't talk about that he talked about a lot is trade policy and making major changes in trade policy for this country that have been written up by many economists as could be really bad. And coming out of the trade policy experience that you had, talk a little bit about what that could mean.
Well, I bring a certain humility to this as a former U.S. trade negotiator, one of whose many accomplishments during the Clinton years was being involved with NAFTA. So when you're involved in something that has then been debated fiercely for 30 years, you have a certain humility about these things. I do think that the Trump tariffs can work, the threat of tariffs can work to prod people to negotiate, and that is one aspect of what you could use the tariffs for. But Trump seems to want to go further than that and use the tariffs, large tariffs, to raise revenues in ways that they don't raise revenues. They don't raise revenues, as you know. The foreign governments don't pay the tariffs. U.S. companies and ultimately U.S. consumers pay the tariffs. So if he were to go ahead with his tariffs at the scale that he wants to, it would be a bad thing for consumers and it would be a bad thing for inflation. So the question is, with Trump, is always, can anyone persuade him, Mr. President, of course, that's a brilliant idea, but we can't quite do it that way. So we'll see. The last trade representative, who was an old friend and adversary of mine, Bob Lighthizer, did a good job in focusing Trump a little bit on China and the problems with China, and talked him out of destroying NAFTA because we needed a North American trade agreement. But it really does depend on what the advisors are saying and what Trump is willing to listen to.
Another major issue you did bring up, but I want to dig a little more deeply into it, is the whole immigration and deportation of potentially millions of immigrants. And I think we probably all understand and see that this is going to be a significant policy here in this country. How it's implemented, none of us know. What ideas and thoughts do you have about what we can do locally here around the issue of immigration? Any thoughts on that?
Well, first, stepping back for a moment, one of my favorite authors wrote in his last book, "We're a nation of immigrants that hates every generation of immigrants." Every generation of immigrants, whether it was Italian or Irish or Jews, etc., they've all faced hostility when they came to this country and then gradually became part of what we used to call the melting pot. Immigration and migration have been a problem that all the advanced countries have been facing. It's been destabilizing in a lot of places, and it's brought down governments around Europe, for instance. I think that, going back for a second, it's like 2013, there was 68 senators that supported Barack Obama's legislation, which would have been a comprehensive legislative fix to the immigration problem, dealing with legal and illegal immigrants and strengthening the borders. 68 senators, and it never got a vote in the House. So that moment passed. In terms of what can be done, I'm not the organizer that you are, but I do think that all of our communities, all of us, know people that are perhaps undocumented or have family members that are undocumented who will be looking for assistance, not financial assistance, but good advice, legal assistance, to tell them when they're actually at risk or not. I think the frightening nature of the threats is going to be terrible for a lot of people. Uh, and so to the extent that this community deals with those that are in the workforce, that are perhaps facing these kind of problems, it would be helpful to give them the best advice you can.
Let me just put an ad in here. I think most of you know I'm involved in the Gaithersburg Beloved Community, play a little role in that. We've been having some conversations around immigration. And in some of our groups that we talk on immigration, we find that there's a lot of misunderstanding about what immigrants are. What do they give back to this country? Why are they important to be here? So we're going to be organizing a large conversation with some experts and people who understand that issue, probably after Christmas. So we'll let you know on that. But it's going to be a big issue here in Gaithersburg with a large number of immigrants that we have, and we've got to play some role in it. So can we hold out hope for the Democrats in 2026? What are your views on the future?
Well, certainly, first of all, a lot of presidents who came into office and thought they had some kind of mandate for change end up overreaching and being repudiated in the off-year elections. Off-year elections are hard for incumbent presidents oftentimes. So I certainly think there's a basis for hope in terms of organizing and getting ready for the next election. I hope the Democrats don't spend all their time. They should review what happened here and try to figure out what to do. But we shouldn't spend all of our time in some circular firing squad, which the Democrats are prone to do. I mean, the progressives are saying that Kamala Harris should not have run around the country with Liz Cheney. Others, on the other, more moderate Democrats, are saying the progressives dominated the agenda and we got too woke, etc. You can find a lot of things that went wrong. I think I was saying to Spence that I pulled this book off my shelf, which is not my book, America, What Went Wrong, written by Bartlett and Steele, two journalists, in 1992. And if you read the beginning of the book, it talks about the inequality in the country. It talks about just how extraordinary it was that a handful of the wealthiest people were starting to dominate the country's wealth. And since then, 30 years later, it's only gotten worse. And I think there's something, I guess this comes back to thinking about trade as well. There is something in trade and globalization that tends to promote inequality. And it's the role of government, it seems to me, to lean against that, to have policies that basically offset that to a degree, rather than reinforce it with another round of tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans. And the failure of the Democrats to articulate the problem of inequality and their responses to it, I think, has been serious. Even though Joe Biden tried. Biden was more pro-worker and pro-union. Biden certainly favored a child tax credit that really reduced child poverty. And, Obama before, in terms of the Affordable Care Act, that was a huge reform and something that needed to be done and reduced inequality in that regard. But we haven't done enough over time. And the idea that Trump became the populist and the advocate for working people is quite remarkable.
Yeah. How do the Democrats get that back? Any ideas?
Well, look, I think they get it back to the extent they do by focusing on inequality, and the policies that help working class people, and essentially doing everything you can to rein in a situation where not just the millionaires, but the billionaires are dominating our politics, our government, and our country. I mean, I don't know about you, but I didn't think there were so many billionaires around until Trump found all of these people. It's quite remarkable.
He helped to make many of them.
Yeah, but the other thing is, I mean, we're all contemporaries. We grew up at a time when there was a very broad American middle class. I was kind of at the bottom of it, but we weren't bombarded every day with the images of the rich, the famous, and the beautiful. You just sort of lived your life, right? If you had a bicycle or a baseball glove, you went to school, and it was obviously, that was a long time ago. It was a different kind of country, different kind of communications, etc. But from I'm saying this fence, I was born in 1947. That's the greatest blessing you could have. Be born in America in 1947. All kinds of opportunities. And the country's changed over time. But the government policies that further exacerbate inequality is a striking part of virtually every Republican administration. And the Democrats ought to be able to frame a contrary message to that.
I am sure that there are a lot of better questions out there than I have asked. So let's open up the floor. Frank, do we have some?
Wait
One
for
right
the
up here.
microphone. Okay.
Please expand on how globalization promotes inequality. I don't understand that.
That's a good question. I was afraid somebody'd ask me to expand on that.
Could you repeat the question?
Okay. Repeat the question.
The question was, I mentioned my view that globalization and technology expanded inequality. And I was asked to explain how that happens. I think that basically globalization has created for the well-educated around the world, there are great opportunities. And there's sort of a small set, relatively small set of people in every country that have benefited hugely from globalization. And people who are facile in certain kinds of professions have benefited. I think that people who have had access and mastered the internet early have benefited. And I think the pace of change has been significant, and that benefits those who are better educated. The fundamental gap that's emerged in the country, as far as we can see, is that between the well-educated and the less well-educated. And that's replicated in mostly every advanced country. So what do you do about it? Well, we haven't done enough about it. You certainly have to deal with basic problems like healthcare and daycare and such things like that. But we've never done very well at job training and creating opportunities for people. I went to a session once where the president of Boeing was speaking. That was before Boeing started getting in real trouble. And he was saying the industry would need a couple of 100,000 airline mechanics in the next decade. And it wasn't clear where they were coming from. I mean, some of them, of course, would be found by the airlines, but there was no real systematic effort to sort of bring people knowledge of the opportunities that were going to be there. In Germany, they did a better job of it. There were other places that did a better job. but we haven't done as good a job as we should.
If you were a betting man, what would you say the odds would be for Project 2025? In 4 years, do you think 50% of it will have passed?
If everyone heard that question, it was, what are the odds on Project 2025 and what percentage of it would pass? I'll freely admit I haven't read the whole thing since it's 900 pages. I do think there will be, I think they are serious about trying to blow up the deep state, as they call it. I don't know that they'll be able to change as many things as they would like to, but they will make, the Trump administration will make the federal workforce, life in the federal workforce pretty awful. And they may try to just simply drive people into retirement. So I'm not going to go item by it because I don't know the whole thing. But I think there'll be a significant effort to basically change the federal workforce and some of the programs that have benefited people in the federal workforce.
One of the elements that concerns me is how masterful the Trump campaign was at dismantling reality, and that I see as a major impediment to the Democrats getting any of that message across going forward. Tom Ellison wrote a great piece. I don't know if you've seen it, but he wrote a great piece about it's amazing how things have turned around just since Trump got elected. Did you realize that since Trump got elected, I've noticed no one's eating cats anymore, and unemployment is at its lowest rate since 4 years ago, and like stating all of the things which are completely true and have been, but somehow got misrepresented and frankly lied about in the campaign, that never got well addressed by the Democrats. The message of the reality of things didn't get across. And so what do Democrats do about helping media get better, get the message better?
Well, that's obviously a great question and a fundamental issue. And I think there are two parts to it. One is, as one of my friends likes to say and has been saying for 20 years, the Democrats suck at messaging. They're not good at it. Biden should have been better at it. Biden was vice president for Obama and realized that Obama wasn't getting credit for his accomplishments. And yet, when Biden was president, we didn't get credit for his accomplishments. One of my friends suggested to the White House that at every infrastructure project, or whatever the president and cabinet members would be there, you should have a sign that said, "Thanks, Joe." Or, but Democrats couldn't do anything that simple. I mean, so there's the Democratic failure in that regard. But the disinformation problem is just a fundamental threat to our democracy, without question. I don't know, it hasn't been proven to me that democracy can survive social media. And everyone getting their own information from their own sources and disinformation. And so somebody said, the Russians are going to interfere in our election and turn us against each other. I said, we don't need them. We can do it. We're doing it fine. No, it's a the fundamental challenge. So we'll see if the Democrats can do a better job, but it won't be easy. The thing that was frustrating to me was that I think we needed a longer campaign, and I think we needed a campaign that allowed for others to compete for the nomination. If Vice President Harris had won it, she'd have been a stronger candidate for having won it. If somebody else had won it, they'd have been a fresh face. But notwithstanding any of that, the disinformation problem remains.
I have a technical question about the Senate. And I never understood how they handle this. You have to have 60 votes for some things. And it's all about the, what do we call it? Yeah, right, the filibuster. Could you explain if there's how they sometimes get around that? And is it possible to filibuster an appointment also? That sort of thing.
It's a great question. It's never been entirely, and I will say that I know something about the Senate rules, although I've never been a genius on the Senate rules. My emphasis in all my books has been on how should senators behave? What does it take to be a real senator? What does it take to be a real Senate leader? So I focus on that rather than the rules. Having said that, there are a lot of things you can do in the Senate under the framework of budget reconciliation. And if it fits into that economic framework, or that where you're having programs and their costs, you can do it with a majority vote. So you see a lot of things getting done through budget reconciliation, including major tax bills that used to have to go through committees and get more votes. Normal, so-called normal legislation in the Senate requires 60 votes to cut off a filibuster. My personal view is, I believed this when the Democrats were in power, and I'm afraid I still believe it, I'd like majority vote. I don't see why you should have to get 60 votes for a gun control measure or an immigration measure, but 50 votes for a tax cut for wealthy people. So now, there will be some people who would say, you don't want to abolish the filibuster now with the Republicans there. I understand that, but you can be sure they will abolish the filibuster as soon as they think it's in their interest. There's no substitute for convincing people about the issues. If you can't find one or two or three or four senators on the Republican side, then you're going to have a hard time in the next 4 years.
What about the relationship between Elon Musk and our president-elect?
Well, it's certainly extraordinary, I think. I mean, for someone who's worried about inequality in America, as I have, as many of you have, the idea that the richest person or the second richest person in the world could spend as much money as he does in the campaign, could run Twitter, take over Twitter and have 200 million followers and turn it into a propaganda for Trump, is quite extraordinary. And giving him this responsibility to allegedly his government efficiency department is quite horrible. Having said that, he doesn't really have any power in reorganizing the government. He'll do what he tries to do, but he has to still convince Congress of certain things, and I don't think he'll be able to do it. Additionally, it has been interesting to see he keeps taking positions that don't convince anybody of anything. he was for Rick Scott to be majority leader, and the senators sort of laughed at that. He was for Matt Gaetz for attorney general, and they laughed at that. So Elon Musk is a brilliant man, but whether he can be effective in politics and government remains to be seen.
Should we be confident that there will be a national election in 4 years?
I don't have 100% confidence by any means. But I think the odds are there'll be an election in 4 years. I think the American people will take a couple of months off and then rally and work on the off-year elections. I think some of the Republicans who will recognize that even though they're scared of Donald Trump, that he's essentially a lame duck at some point, because despite his possible attitudes, he's not going to be president after this 4 years. I think there'll be an election in 4 years, but we have to work to make sure that that happens.
Okay, I have a question. With the 2 attempts on Donald Trump's life, I'm concerned about the vice presidential candidate, Vance, and I'm just wondering, what are your expectations of him?
Some of my friends think Vance is worse than Trump because he's smarter. I never use the phrase worse than Trump. I think Trump is special. Obviously, I wouldn't be very comfortable or very happy if Vance became president or got elected president later. But he's smart, and he has shown an ability to change his shapeshift. He has a smart wife. He may learn something from her over time, although at the moment she seems to have bought into the MAGA stuff as well. I don't know what's going to happen with Vance. I think the idea that he could become the vice president before he was even 40 or right around age 40 is pretty horrifying. But we didn't beat them. So we've got him at the moment.
Good evening. Sorry. So my question is it's 2 parts. The first one is, I know you gave a description of what you thought the reasons are that Kamala lost and Donald Trump won. And I'm wondering if you've taken the time to speak to an actual Trump voter and supporter to find out what their thoughts were. And my second part, given that there were so many Trump supporters, as evidenced by the result of the election, do you think that we Trump supporters are just evil or just ignorant?
Well, I have spoken to some Trump supporters. I spent a rather thankless Saturday in Pennsylvania campaigning before the election, so I spoke to some Trump supporters. I'll admit most of my knowledge of Trump supporters is reading press and focus groups, etc., and getting some of their attitudes there. I think some of them are misinformed and disinformed. Others of them, I think, voted on a couple of issues that raise legitimate concerns in their mind, having to do with inflation, for one. I don't think that was handled very well by the Democrats in terms of how we thought about it. Inflation and the border. The border was not handled well by the Biden administration. And I think the Democrats paid a price for the border. So I think there are a lot of, I also think, though, that the election was lost by Kamala because Democrats didn't vote. Trump's vote, I guess, and by the way, I'm hesitating because California is always coming in still. But Trump's vote was about 2 million more than he got 4 years ago when he lost. But Kamala's was, I think, 7 million less than Biden got. There were a lot of people who I was counting on to vote, and particularly younger people, who didn't feel impelled to vote, didn't think it was important, thought they didn't like the fact that Biden waited so long, or they didn't like the Gaza war. So there were a lot of things going on. I think some of the voters are probably ignorant, but I don't ascribe that to most of them.
I have a nightmare that I would like for you to maybe assuage. If I were going to plot to allow Trump to be president again in 2027, here's what I would do. I would tell him to run for vice president, switch places with his current vice president. If that ticket won, it would be with the understanding the vice president, after a month or two, would resign. If that vice president resigned, I cannot see any reason why Trump wouldn't immediately become president again. That's my little nightmare. Can you in any way reduce that for me?
Yeah, Spence is reminding me that's kind of what Putin did at one point with Medvedev, who became briefly president of Russia, and then they switched jobs at some point. Look, this has been an unusual time, and so many things have happened that we couldn't have predicted. I would say that what you've described is the least of my worries. I don't think Trump, at the age of 82, will decide to run for vice president so that he could then become president. But, you know, a lot of strange things have happened in this period that we wouldn't have counted on. Somebody said to me recently, aren't you depressed about all this? And I said, no, I'm not. I haven't been depressed in the whole time. And the reason is, I think that it's been extraordinarily interesting. We've lived through an astonishing period. And when I say that, I don't mean it glibly. The Trump era has been astonishing. And COVID was really the first life-changing, world-changing experience for those of us who grew up after World War II. Unbelievable to think back on what COVID did. And I think it had some continuing political effect too. So we've lived through extraordinary times, and they haven't been good times. I mean, when I held up the book and said that 30 years since they wrote that book, if you think about it, we've had kind of an awful 21st century, right? 9/11 to start, the ill-advised war in Iraq, the collapse, the Lehman collapse and the subprime mortgage collapse. That was all before Trump. And if I had to look back on another deciding moment, I would say it was when we had the hope, the political system and the country responded by electing Barack Obama. Hope and change, and a Democratic Congress. And I think they made some mistakes in bailing out the banks without bailing out people. I think it had a large effect on people's attitudes that nobody ever got punished for the subprime mortgages and everything else that went wrong. So it's been a long and not great 21st century, but we've got to fight on.
Back here.
One more question. I think I'm probably going to be taking you back to your last answer a little bit. I wanted to take you back to your area of expertise about Senate leadership and this problem that you've identified in a lot of the election debriefs about the inability of the Democratic ticket to address the real concerns of non-college educated working class people. I heard Ruben Gallego describe his success at going after Latin men whose main concern was, how do I support my family? And they did not vote for Harris. So I want you to describe where you think Senate leadership in particular, which you've studied, what were some opportunities that the Senate failed on in terms of addressing those kinds of opportunities that we may have had in government, whether it was during the Obama years or others, to really seriously address the economic inequality or inability of people non-college educated to get ahead in this increasingly technical society? Sorry.
That's quite a question.
No answer?
No, I think it's a great question. I would say a couple of things preliminarily. I'm not a journalist or an academic. And so the value of my books partly is that I've been in government, both in the legislative branch and the executive branch. What that brings is sort of a recognition of how hard it is to get things done. That you can get things done, but the predicate for getting things done in government is good faith on both sides. And I think the Republicans have made it very difficult. The environment I grew up in when I was working in the Senate was there was a lot of good faith on both sides. And a lot of things got done. And then over time, starting with Newt Gingrich particularly, but over time it changed. And so what happens is it's really tough to get anything done. So if you look at what Obama did, and if you look at what Biden did, facing the kind of opposition they faced, you find that they accomplished a lot. It's kind of impressive what they accomplished. They didn't accomplish enough, and they had to give up parts of their program in order to get anything through. So in the absence of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1933, it's very tough to enact, or Lyndon Johnson maybe in 1965, it's very tough to cite all the things that need to be done for the country and then get them done. And we haven't been able to do it for that reason. But certainly, I think if you look, and here we come back to democratic messaging, there's a huge percentage of the jobs that have been created in the last 30 years that were created during Clinton's time, Obama's time, and Biden's time. Very few in the Bush and Trump years in comparison. We haven't been able to convey that message in a way that wins people's confidence.
Well, let's thank the speakers very much.
I got one more thing.
One more. Wait, one more question.
One more. I'm gonna do a plug for his book, which is right here. We're not gonna sell them up here, but it's a great book. Robert Reich said, describe the book as a gripping narrative and a must-read. You can get the book in hardback, ebook, paperback, and go online